Hello and welcome to You've Seen It Before, movie reviews with connections in mind. Midway is coming out in theaters this November, and as with many historical films, there will certainly be elements of the film that are true, but other elements that are exaggerated, completely made up, and characters that didn't exist that are actually amalgams of real people, what have you. This is just a video that I wanted to do that gives a brief overview of the true historical events that this movie Midway will be hopefully representing faithfully or as faithfully as can be had. But I feel it's important with these sorts of films to know your history before going into it and judge the film based on how well it represents that history is one way to go about it. I did this previously with before the release of Dunkirk 2 years ago, and I just wanted to do it again to give you some a brief overview, by no means complete overview, of the Battle of Midway, which occurred in June 4th through the 7th, where the actual events took place in 1942. Some background before this. This takes place approximately 7 months after the events of the attack of on Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, that was. Basically, from the start of from the attack of Pearl Harbor till this point, the Japanese army has been sweeping across the Pacific, and they had the strategic initiative for all this time. The U.S. was really on a back heel this whole time, and it was really looking like the U.S. needed a big push in order to stop Japanese momentum in the Pacific and start to reverse this momentum, because up until this point, there was nothing that necessarily prevented the Japanese from attacking U.S. soil again. They were making inroads to attack the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, eventually isolate Australia from the Pacific theater, so that the Japanese could eventually create their Greater Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was their fancy way of saying a giant empire ruled by Japan. Now, the Japanese figured that they wanted to, with the attack on Pearl Harbor, their original goal was to essentially destroy the U.S. fleet outright, so that they could essentially rule, act with impunity in the Pacific without U.S. interference. And while the attack on Pearl Harbor did indeed inflict some heavy losses, both in loss of life and in ships damaged and sunk, while the real goal of the Japanese attack on that day was the American carrier force, but the carrier force was out at sea at the time, so they could not get it. However, the carrier forces were always on the mind of the Japanese Navy as targets, because without the carrier force and with a sufficient number of other U.S. ships sunk, then the ability of the U.S. Navy to impact the Japanese, their actions in the Pacific would have been greatly reduced, and it was hoped by the Japanese military that with a one big decisive blow of the U.S. fleets, that at best the U.S. would sue for peace and essentially bow out of the war, so that the Japanese could go about their business and create this influence in Japan, in the Pacific theater. They wanted to do this by capturing Midway Atoll, which is approximately, as the name suggests, halfway between Japan and Hawaii. And if the Japanese had taken Midway and established a base there, they were about 1,000 miles from Hawaii, and from there it would have been only a few hundred miles more to the U.S. mainland, which sounds like a lot, but it would have been proverbially a much closer stone's throw away from U.S. territory that the Japanese could launch attacks from, and the U.S. was definitely not comfortable with that. So they took this threat very seriously. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, however, they had this very intricate plan on a series of counter moves, feints, there was actually a plan with which was to capture a couple of the Aleutian Islands, which would have suggested that that was their main target of invasion. So in order to theoretically draw U.S. forces away from Midway and divide or potentially divide the U.S. fleet, so that when the real target, Midway Atoll, was attacked, that theoretically the U.S. forces would be divided. And in fact, the Japanese did invade two of the Aleutian Islands, which are part of Alaska, and occupied them, which represents the first time that U.S. territory was occupied since the War of 1812. And of course, it was the last time that U.S. territory was ever occupied by a foreign power. Unbeknownst to all this, the Japanese had a very intricate plan. Admiral Yamamoto, who had planned the attack on Pearl Harbor, he planned this attack. He was very intricately had a very intricate plan in motion, but it was very complicated. Unbeknownst to the Japanese at the time, the U.S. had broken the Japanese encryption. So the U.S. was regularly reading Japanese coded transmissions, and they had intercepted a whole bunch of messages that that basically said that something called MI, I believe, was using that was the target of the Japanese fleet. In order to confirm this and convince the naval intelligence leadership that this was the case, a plan was devised for Midway to send an uncoded transmission saying that their water reclamation, their water purifiers were broken down, so they were running out of fresh water. And they were listening for references, and the U.S. codebreakers were listening to see if the target in question, which either actually it was AF or something along those lines. It was a 2-letter code phrase that they thought was Midway Atoll. And sure enough, the Japanese made a coded transmission, which was later decoded by the U.S. intelligence, that said that this code AF or whatever was running low on fresh water, basically confirming that Midway was the target. So on the battle in question, once the battle actually began, this was one of the first battles that basically defined modern naval battles at the time, dominantly establishing the carrier as a major player in naval warfare. Other battles have done this before, with such as the taking down of the Bismarck in the Atlantic by carrier forces, and the Battle of Taranto, the raid on Taranto, the Italian Navy over in Europe. However, with Midway and the earlier Battle of the Coral Sea, these were major naval battles in the Pacific where carrier forces, not battleships, were the deciding factor. And in fact, Midway is somewhat unique in the annals of naval combat history, in that the main ships of these opposing forces, the U.S. and the Japanese, never saw each other. In fact, they were about 700 miles apart from each other, or maybe not 700, but they were hundreds of miles away from each other by the time, and they never saw each other eye to eye. This was a battle entirely made by naval aviation. So the actual battle consisted of the first Japanese wave launched a attack on Midway Island proper. The Midway had a airbase with a squadron of fighters and dive bombers, but they were relatively obsolete. They took heavy casualties. The Japanese did some heavy damage to Midway base, but they didn't completely knock it out. So that's why, crucially, the leader of the Japanese air wing, in control of the main carrier force, said a second wave was going to be necessary in order to completely neutralize the island prior to a land invasion. So once the Japanese planes landed and had on their carriers and had to start refueling and rearming their planes, it was then seen that U.S. planes launched from carriers outside, namely the Enterprise, the Hornet, and the Yorktown, which surprisingly enough was heavily damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea only a few days, only a matter of weeks prior to this. And the Japanese thought the USS Yorktown was sunk at the Coral Sea, but it was not sunk. It was just heavily damaged, and remarkably, the guys at Pearl Harbor managed to repair the damage within 3 days in order to make it combat ready. These planes launched from these carriers found the Japanese fleet, and the Japanese Combat Air Patrol engaged them. There was a air battle involved, and the Japanese launched a wave against these carriers. However, after this wave then came back, because during all this time, there was a bunch of indecision as to whether bombs should be loaded onto the Japanese planes or torpedoes against ships should be loaded. And they actually got swapped out a couple times, so much so that the ordnance on these Japanese carriers was not stowed properly in the magazines where they're safe from explosions. They were actually scattered around the hangars that are below the main flight deck. So they were extremely vulnerable, especially when these planes were taken below decks to refuel to get sent out again. So when U.S. carrier-based, carrier-launched dive bombers and torpedo bombers found the Japanese carriers, they were essentially giant powder kegs with this ordnance and this fuel in mid-progress, and the prior attack by the U.S. carrier-based fighter squadrons knocked the Japanese fighter patrol out of position. So the Japanese actually lost 4 of their carriers. I believe they only had six or seven carriers in their entire fleet at the time. So this was a massive blow to their operations. And while the U.S. did lose the USS Yorktown to Japanese forces, the combined loss of Japanese ships and trained pilots were massive losses that they could not easily replace, not nearly as easily as the U.S. could replace their losses. And this, combined with the subsequent invasion and capture of Guadalcanal in and around this time, was a decisive turning point in the war in the Pacific against the Japanese. From this point on, the Japanese lost strategic initiative, and the U.S. would continue to have the momentum throughout the rest of the war. So again, this is a very brief overview of the order of battle. There are so many other details I could have gone into. That's a longer video meant for other things. And honestly, the internet does a pretty good job, and books have done a really good job of cataloging this event. This is just meant to give you the background of this event, and hopefully going into Midway, if you're going to see it in theaters, you can appreciate it more going into this. So thank you all for watching. I appreciate whatever audience I can get. Be sure to look for my review of Roland Emmerich's Midway coming out this November. And as always, if you like what you see on my channel, this video or any other video on my channel, please give me a like, share, and subscribe. I'd very much appreciate it. Again, thank you so much for watching. But just remember, there is nothing new under the sun. And yes, you have seen it before.